As crunch meeting to review economic measures introduced to reduce the suffering of the people in the Republic of Ghana comes to an end, we would actually be spending quality time on what former President Mahama has been proposing, some tough measures, including how to fix the ailing economy of Ghana. We shall be reviewing all of the suggestions on the table, ranging from firing incompetent ministers in this administration to subscribing to an IMF program. When we return from this break. You're welcome back. My name is Raymond Acquah, and tonight on UPfront, much of what we are actually going to spend our quality time on is to review the current system that we have in the country. This system is supposed to have delivered the goals that we've actually been looking out for, and we are keeping an eye on that crunch meeting by top-level economic managers in the country as they try to fashion a way out of the current nation's economic misery. Ahead of that, though, a man who has been at the helm of affairs in times past, former President John Mahama, has been speaking on the economy, confronting the current government with tough words and proposals, including the call for the immediate removal of the finance minister and others from office.
I just want to say that Ghana cannot afford to wait for a new common framework for debt treatment beyond DSSI before we act on a precarious debt situation. While the President is lamenting about the non-renewal of DSSI, we cannot say we're waiting for the international community to come with a new program before we begin to do something about our debt. We would have gone the Sri Lanka way long before that new program will be available. We should also note that even if those two initiatives are renewed, they will not be enough to address our problem, given how far our economy has deteriorated in the last 2 years, and the current structure of our debt, which is heavily tilted towards commercial loans. Debt restructuring has therefore become unavoidable if we are to overcome the present economic problem. The President must make the big and very important call and begin the process to restructure our debt before we become like Sri Lanka, which has sunk into unimaginable economic and social crisis. For those of you who watch CNN and other news channels, you see what is happening in Sri Lanka. Even more importantly, the unbridled and unsustainable borrowing must stop immediately. Like I said, they must put a moratorium on additional non-concessional borrowing. We can no longer afford to dither and fiddle while our economy heads for the precipice. The consequence of that will be too grave to comprehend. Meanwhile, it will serve the President well to use some items from the presidential toolkits in times of crisis such as this. There's a toolkit with some items in it that presidents can use when they are faced with this kind of crisis. The first is he should address the nation and explain the situation in which we are and rally the support of the citizens behind any economic program that he wants to put forward. The second is he should fire his finance minister. And the third is he should conduct a major shake-up of his government to remove all the many dead woods that have turned ministries into their kingdoms. And then finally, he should huddle with the best brains of this country to formulate a comprehensive recovery plan for our economy. Unfortunately, even though I said some of this in my first speech at Ghana at the Crossroads, the President has refused to take any of these measures. He no longer talks to the people, no major address to the people about the current situation, no interviews with the press, and so definitely I don't know when he's going to take advantage. His finance minister is his cousin. He's afraid to fire him, or because of the relations they have, he's not inclined to do so. Many of the ministers who have superintended over ministries that are non-performing have some political links with the President, and therefore it makes it impossible for him to remove them from their positions, even when he himself can see that some of those ministers have presidential ambitions. And I mean, it should be easy for you to remove them so that they can concentrate on their presidential ambitions. but not this president. I suggested to him to do a Senchi-style forum, like we did, gather all the best brains in the country to think through, because they say, Nyansa ni obako fotim. And so if you gather all the best brains and bring them together, no matter their political inclination, suggestions will come out that will help you come up with a proper fiscal consolidation policy that you can take to any multilateral institution in order that you get some relief.
We'll later be joined by the immediate past Finance Minister Secretary in this conversation. But now, joining me via Zoom is that distinguished economist and former JIMPA rector, Professor Stephen Ade. Good evening and welcome to you, Prof. I'll be very glad if you could unmute, Prof. And good evening to you once again and welcome to this discussion.
Good evening. Ray, how are you?
I'm doing very well. I hope you are in good health too, sir.
By His grace, I am. But if I knew that my former boss, because I was on the advisory board of the Ministry of Finance during SET, if I knew he was coming, I would have declined for two reasons. First, you don't come and sit with your boss. Number two, if you bring him, then you should have brought Kanoforiata, not me, because I'm not going to speak for MPP.
You were a professor when I was a student.
Yeah. But that was, you always say so that the elder was there when the chief was born. So I agree on that one.
I give up, sir, but I don't really mind. It was nice working with
you. Once we are here, I have to behave myself. So go ahead.
Yeah, Prof, it's the very reason why we're having this conversation is that we understand the finance minister and some other senior ministers in the government are currently almost completing a crunch meeting called for a specific purpose to review measures that were introduced earlier in the year to try and stem the tide of the current economic decline. This is what is brought about this conversation. What is the way forward? We understand currently the review is almost nearing an end. Already, government officials, we understand, are also having conversations with the Bretton Woods institution for a simple engagement, something we did in 2015, also being brought back on board. Let me first get to appreciate from where you sit, whether or not going to the IMF is an avoidable option on the table.
First of all, thank you for this opportunity. Let me first comment, since your former President Mahama's speech. First of all, I want to congratulate him for coming up with concrete suggestions, because at least, despite the political innuendos, I think that he has put something on the table. There's no doubt at all. I think that two of them, he knows that if he were asked to do it, he would say that somebody, your rival or somebody who is looking for your position says, fire your finance minister. I don't think that that is too much of that wasn't to me. Also, the issue of reshuffling of the cabinet, I will leave it to, but I think that there are two things that he had said, which for me, they are quite important.
Forgive me. I think there was a break when you started talking about the finance minister. Exactly.
Oh,
yes.
Okay. Is it better now?
It is wonderful now. So exactly what's your view on his
call? What I'm saying is that I wouldn't like to comment on firing the finance minister, because I don't think that he would have taken that advice. That is the prerogative of the president. And also, but the two things he has said, so much of it, I wouldn't comment on it. I don't want this to become a political platform.
Certainly.
We are here to the economy of Ghana. One thing he said, which I supported, is the importance of the leadership addressing the nation periodically. I think that the president has been too silent. COVID is now really rearing its ugly head. We are not hearing anything. There's an economic crisis which people are demonstrating. I think that that was an important contribution by His Excellency, the former president. The second has to do with the bringing the best brain. I hope it doesn't mean that the brains which are being used now are not good, but I think that in the crisis, you broaden the consultation. Some inbreeding becomes dangerous because you have what we call in leadership group think, whereby people who think alike, people who owe their bread and butter to you as the leader, you need some other fresh air. And I think that the Senchi Style Forum was due a long time ago. And I must admit that I was part of the Senchi discussion. I was one of the 6 people who chaired the Senchi discussions and came to the accord. And, you know, I was actually away when I had an urgent call. To my surprise, I was in Ngranza when the then vice president says that, Stephen, I want you tomorrow morning. I said, what is it? And I had to pay my own airfare to come to Senchi. But it was just a joy to be part of that discussion. So those two I picked. Now, when it comes to the IMF, going to the IMF, I think it's not a matter of, when you are thirsty, so take the bucket and go and get any water. Senche was not a matter of go to IMF. We discussed all the options and we were convinced that the best for the country was to go to the IMF. And I think that I would like us to discuss the issues here, which if you want, I don't know whether I should come around so that my Honorable Tekwe will speak first, but you have to analyze the situation and then it becomes the conclusion rather than the start. Because when you go to the IMF, there are only 2 things, 3 things that is involved in going to the IMF. Number 1, it's certain leadership decisions which the local people are not be able to take, which will come for the say, I can come to the reason. The second has to do with not able to come up with the policy option and the hard decisions that would enable a turnaround in a difficult economic circumstance. And the third, hopefully, is some sort of financial support. These are the 3 reasons. And I would like to come back to them and take them one by one. Is there a leadership challenge vis-a-vis the crisis? Are the policies which are being implemented capable of taking us out of the wood? And thirdly, is it possible that we can raise our own resources internally or from the market, or we have no option financially to go for that support? These are the 3 things that should influence any advice to go to the IMF or not. But I will hold my gun for now, because each one of them requires serious look at, and I'm prepared to do so.
I am completely convinced this conversation will be very exciting. And Prof, I'll come back to you in a jiffy. Let me hear some introductory remarks from the former Finance Minister. The Honorable Secretary, you're welcome to our front.
Thank you very much. Let me start with the prerogative of the President to sack. I would take that to be an advice from one president to another president. I'm not up to that weight yet, and so I think I would like to address the other 2 points out of the 3. Just like Prof did. Yes, Prof was assenting, and it was very open, and I'm glad that he's the one confirming that it was quite open. I had traveled also and then come back. Got my team at Ministry of Finance to work on the agenda, prepare briefs, for the meeting. We consulted on the various committees who were to head them. And the decision from Cabinet was to be open, even though there were specific invitations. So there were people who just came to Senchi, not on the list. They were allowed to participate, and it was, quite important. And let me also state that at Senchi, we had tabled the homegrown. If you remember, we did a 2013 budget ahead of Senchi, and we had outlined our policies, which we call the homegrown policy, which, by the way, we had drawn up with the support or assistance of the African Development Bank. The chief economist himself was in Ghana to lead the process. So it wasn't like, an internal thing which we had, just, officials of only the Ministry of Finance. And it is for these and other reasons that when eventually we opted for the ECF, or the IMF agreement, we tabled, the homegrown policy, which was deemed to be substantive. And I can refer you and your producers to the letter of intent and the memorandum of economic policy, which was agreed. And you will see that all the structural measures, not all of them, but the majority of them, and some which we had the lateral, like sinking fund and the rest, are there, because we insisted that we were middle income and we wanted those policies to be there. Let me also state that when it came to the fund, in the course of the discussions, we actually tabled two options. The first one was what you call a policy support instrument, or for short PSI, which is what Kenya, and others, do now. And what it means is that, yes, we are subject to advice from the fund. We put in our input, we come into an agreement, we specify the performance, criteria and everything, but it does not come with immediate financial support. And that was what we floated that because, as you know, we had done the PRMA. There was the petroleum revenues that were coming in. The PRMA had been passed by Parliament. We had set up the sinking fund. And so we were convinced that we could manage, and then as and when we needed a fund, resources, we could still draw down. We still had the option, of drawing down, but not as a condition for. But we opted for ECF primarily because at the point taking single spine, and the oil, the lack of gas flow from Nigeria and all that, which led to do so. Some of the development partners, I don't want to be specific here, decided that they thought it would be good for us to do an ECF with, as the president said today, former president said today, softer term facilities, than would have been the case if we went to the market, though eventually we went to the market. Because we were also under a 500 million potentially commercial loan moratorium. So the former president is not saying something which we did, in fact, throughout the ECF. The commercial loan we could take was 500. But eventually, looking at the weight of everything, the consensus from Senchi was that we should do the ECF, which we did. So I just want to put this in context, that there is some experience, with what my boss, the former president, was saying. And I must say that, typical of the Ministry of Finance, some of these options, before and after, were tabled before the advisory committee, of which Prof. Was a member. So he is actually bipartisan, more or less. When I tell people that he did also serve, and he was actually on the advisory committee for my former boss, Dr. Dufour, before continuing. So for 8 years. So that is what I had to say with respect to the three. When it comes to the IMF, let me qualify a bit of what you said. In fact, every country is in constant consultation with the IMF. There are staff visits, which, the staff of the IMF do, and they did one, recently, I think immediately after the budget or during the budget. And that is it's a regular thing. That's why we have a mission chief. That's why we have a resident office. And that's why we have economists and others assigned. And when they come, often they come with the World Bank, which is a sister institution. Because if you do a program, it goes to the World Bank board as well. Because much of the budget support comes from the World Bank, African Development Bank, and others. So they are seriously engaged. And in our case, we open it up, including development partners. We met at City House under the chairmanship of Dr. Botri. The other point I'd like to make is that in addition to that, you are obliged to open your books, Article 4. And that also is a regular, periodic, rather, engagement with the IMF. And whether you are in a program or not, you know, your financial situation will become open. The IMF, you are obliged, you know, to inform the IMF, program or no program. So you would notice that we had exited the IMF in 2018, thereabout, but in 2019, much of the adjustments that the IMF did was in the Article 4 of 2019. It was not in the ECF, which the MPP took over. And so we may find ourselves where there could be a follow-up of the staff visit, or the staff visit could be converted to an Article 4. And everything that would have been in a program would be there anyway, you know, and that will be compared by the financial markets in particular with what is in the budget, which did not prevent our downgrade by the rating and other agencies. So the question is, if we do not opt for the IMF, given these scenarios and the fact that whatever, you know, I hear people saying, oh, but there's information you don't have to give to the fund if you are not in the program. No. Even the mighty United States, Germany, and the rest are subject to Article 4. That is the protocol. And therefore, there's no question as to whether you can decide what information you give to the fund, you know, or not. So I just like to give this scenario. So if you are subject to disclosure, full disclosure, then what is the point when you could get the benefit of softer loans compared to, you know, the syndicated loan, which, you know, my former boss analyzed, which I wouldn't want to, you know, to repeat because it is expensive. Coming after the zero-rated, you know, coupon, zero coupon bond, for which out of 550 value, we got only 350, but we are going to be repaying in 2026 the full 500 or 550. And so if you consider that you got 350 and it was 500, you are giving up 150, and just divide 150 by either the 350 you got or the 550, and the implied interest rate is steep because we couldn't go to the markets. You know, when we go to the market, that's what we got. And it is these kind of terms that prevented us from going to the market last year, and we have virtually ruled it out, you know, this year. And here we are again going for syndicated loans, which, as is stated and analyzed beautifully, is for 5 years, 7 years. The two, one is for 7, one is for 5. And then also repayment is suspended. And to be in the court of, you know, the next government, no. And I believe that, you know, because there's enough on the plate for 2026 onwards, you know, so this habit of postponing, you know, collateralization, paying interest, and throwing the principal for somebody to cater, I don't think it's the best, because that is the primary reason we can come to it, why we set up the sinking fund to stop that habit of suspending principal repayment. And we used it to take off, you know, a substantial part, 550 out of the 750 of the first sovereign bond. So I would pause again, you know, at this point, having given, you know, this scenario, you know, of what former President Mahama, you know, was saying, and the relationship, the constant relationship that a country, contrary to what people believe, that the country has, you know, with the IMF. And in the interest of disclosure, I always like to state that I worked in the IMF for almost 10 years after the value-added tax.
It's interesting, and some of your experiences what we are counting on tonight's edition of Upfront. My guest, Professor Stephen Adair, and also Secretary, who is a former finance minister, are the ones helping us understand what's currently happening. And as I speak to you, there's an ongoing conversation at the highest places in government, a crunch meeting. That meeting is geared at one single agenda: try to review what we introduced in March as the measures to help us fix the economy and see the way forward. Top on the agenda too is our possible engagement with the IMF on a deal, and we'll be hearing from these gentlemen on that. I understand I'll take a break. After the break, I'll be coming to Prof, for example, for a conversation on the specific he raised earlier. Is this a perfect time for us to do what we are doing? Are we failing in leadership? And are the solutions we are put in place not really working? After this break, Upfront continues. You're welcome back to Upfront. My name is Raymond Acquah, and we are still keeping an eye on that crunch meeting in government where the very measures that were introduced to specifically stem the tide when it comes to the economic situation in the country are being reviewed, and we are bringing it to a close or a final answer this thing. What we are looking out for is the major decisions that will be made at the end of this particular meeting. Those decisions, we understand, may or may not include a possibility of having to subscribe to an IMF program. Joining me for conversations, I'm arrived from 6 p.m. is the former Finance Minister, Secretary, and also a distinguished economist by all standards and qualifications, Professor Stephen Adair. Prof, you're welcome back. But I needed to come to you on this point you raised earlier. You were asking whether or not it was possible for us to look at this from the lens of the current situation. Is there a leadership challenge to fix our current problem? Have we been able? Does the leadership have the moral authority? Do we have the wherewithal in terms of competence and the discipline to fix the current problems that we have?
These journalists ask difficult questions. I think that you have put that question to President Mahama before he left. On a more serious note, I am a rep, and for this statement, leadership is cause, everything else is effect. Probably the only thing globally I am noted for, if you Google. And definitely, what we are facing as an economic problem is a leadership challenge. And it requires an exceptional leadership in order to get us out of it. Leadership which is capable of getting the best of advice, leadership capable of making sure that all the principal agencies and institutions are singing from the same hymn book. And here I'm talking about the Ministry of Finance, the Bank of Ghana. Forget about this so-called independence of a Bank of Ghana in a developing country. No. And the ministers, for example, whilst, we are talking about expenditure control, if you hear the Minister of Agriculture, Minister of Education, they are all talking about expansionary programs. They are going to do this and that and that and that. And this is, you really must have a leadership that has the vision and willing to call everybody to order and insist on really bringing the best brains together. It is a serious national challenge we face. I personally think that, and here I'm not talking about only President Akufo-Addo's government, our cabinets, no, you have all Tom, Dick, and Harry. The proponents of the Constitution said that the cabinet should be about 19 or so ministers. We managed to get them to about 85. It used to be more than 110. And you go, all of them, you have the party chairman, general secretaries, all of them, so that at a cabinet serious decision, others people are thinking about, am I going to be the next party chairman or not? No, you need a real select team and then getting the best of advice. I think that this is a challenge which has nagged the country for many years. And at this moment, we have to see the president rising up to the occasion, or else Ghana is going to have serious difficulties getting out of this crisis.
But you did mention that the president should rise up to the occasion. But we have an economic management team already in place. As of 2019, it looked like we were fine. And in 2020, in fact, even in 2019, I do recall that the World Economic Outlook had given an indication that we were in high risk of debt distress. Can the current leadership be trusted to steer us out of the current situation we find ourselves?
I'm not getting an answer to your question, but I'll give an illustration to that. You know the one who led Perestroika? The one who led Perestroika was Gorbachev. If anybody was prototypical communist. It was him.
Okay.
He grew up at the equivalent of our young pioneer, became KGB head, member of the Politburo, became its chairman, and then became president. And he said, I don't know, someone says that his mother was a Christian and I prayed for him all his life, but decided to turn around. So it is possible, but this is where, but at this moment, given when I hear the various ministers almost talking at cross purposes, when it's time to stop expenditures, narrowing, and the Minister of Finance says this, the others are saying the other things. I don't see synchronization of the policies of the Bank of Ghana in support of that of the minister. In other words, I don't see economic leadership. And I'm not a privy to the economic management team, but come on, I mean, if what happened in the cabinet meetings of all the governments, you go to the economic management team and it may be possible that everybody is looking for their sectoral interests. Leadership says that, this is the way you listen to everybody and this is the way we are going. I think that there are two occasions where I was impressed with the leadership of the country. In recent times, and not all the time, people like to go to Nkrumah. Only those of us who were born in the first half of the first century, the last century, know Nkrumah. All the rest talking about math, they don't know anything. But of recent year, we had three decisions. First, it was, I said two, but actually it's three. 1983, I think after a disastrous beginning of Rawlings in August, he decided to buy the bullet and went for a very drastic turnaround. Even though I was a senior government official, he himself was always struggling with it, and that saw a change. Unfortunately, we go down to the almost brink of destruction before we are able to. The other one was President Kufuor taking the bold decision to go HIPIC. It was a leadership decision. I'm just using the past. And I must say that President Mahama in Sanchez said that he would go to the IMF, buy the bullet, was a good decision. Because personally, the reason why I supported it is that at that point, if we didn't go to the IMF, despite my boss that was sitting there, you wouldn't have gotten everybody to sing from the same tune. They will undermine him, and as they are doing, other elements are doing to undermine the Minister of Finance at the moment, is happening. And I think that was a decision, let us go, even at the cost of my presidency. So I think that this is, at this moment, that is the type of decision I'm expecting to come out if Ghana is not to go from bad to worse. And that, whether it will come or not, capacity, I think that in terms of there may be, but whether the leadership decision, I'm not sure. So I will leave it to the end of the deliberations to comment on that.
Now, I get the point you are seeking to raise there. There are those who have already said, it's just been 2015. Exactly why did we move from what was described by the IMF in 2015 as a country whose economy is on the bend? In fact, in 2019, there's an article that says, among other things, that the outcome of the IMF program we went into, Ghana's economy is on the bend. The trade and budget deficits are narrowing. The pace of economic growth is poised to rise in 2019 for what was the case in 2015. Inflation rate is projected to fall to 8% from almost 19%. Cuts to wasteful spending made room for much needed social services, such as free secondary education. For Ghana's 28 million people, it all adds to higher incomes, better job opportunities, and more purchasing power. It just sounded a small warning. Still, Ghana remains largely reliant on foreign financing, exposing it to swings in investor sentiments. Maintaining fiscal discipline will also be a challenge. This is perhaps the last words the IMF left with us in the year 2019. For a country to almost go back to the same point, repeating and rolling back the areas we did with debt sustainability, the strengthening of the monetary policies that we put together, and all the other things we had actually been compelled or agreed to do in the space. Mr. Takpe, can we do it without an IMF program currently?
Well, thank you very much. And I'm glad that you pointed to the 2016 indicators. And remember what I said. Remember that from those programs, I mentioned one of them, $550 million US, not Ghana cedis, of our own money was what we used, to pay off the first sovereign bond and then, refinance 200 million. In fact, the 200 million additional was left in the kitty, and the current government used it on October 4th, 2017 to pay off the balance on the sovereign bond. Now, also recall that part of the buffers that, were left at the end of 2016, particularly the stabilization fund, was what came in handy, the 250 million when COVID struck, which tells you that, yes, it's important to prepare during good times, for the crisis, because you cannot run an economy for 3 to 4 years without, going through one crisis or the other. And what has been lacking in developing countries, with the transition economies either to the EU, the BRIC economies, Asian tigers learned to do. And that was the blueprint we were following, was build buffers when the times are good and draw on them. And that's the only way you don't go to the fund. So if with 3 oil fields, we had continued putting in money into the stabilization fund rather into consumption, probably we would have accumulated 600 to 700, maybe more, in the stabilization fund. And it would have been easier to beat our chest and say, we have enough money, we are only going partially, if not completely, to the fund. And we would therefore have required maybe 200, 300 million, not 1 billion. After the exit, we went back. I mean, where is the pride? After the exit, we went back for 1 billion from the IMF. And remember the COVID-19 loan under the RCF, it is rapid, and therefore that is why it has less conditionalities. But it is no less a facility. It is RCF, it stands for Rapid Credit Facility. Just as the ECF is for Enhanced Credit Facility. So we went back. We went back for an IMF program, only it was without, preconditions. We went back, took our own money, SDR. And I can imagine that if we had had that SDR of 1 billion, given our infrastructure agenda, you would have seen at least 3 or 4 major projects springing out of that money. Or we could have used it to enhance our position with the fund, or use it to boost our reserve. By the way, we did not take the ECF loan for budget support. It went to Bank of Ghana, to support the reserves and the currency, which was also crucial at the time. And we turned to the World Bank and others for budget support and for guarantees, to support the budget. So that is what I have to say, that this again buttresses my point about the constant engagement. Even when we were told that we had exited the IMF, we were negotiating with them, for the RCF and for the SDR was no negotiation. Now, secondly, you keep mentioning 2019. If you read the Article 19 carefully, and I urge you to read it, you will see that the Article 19, subject to some corrections, show that between the Article 19 November, which was released November 2019, and the RCF loan, the COVID loan in March 2020, there was a fiscal gap. The fund had made adjustments and was showing a fiscal gap of 5 to 7%. And that is the reason why, despite getting almost 6 billion US dollars for COVID, including 7% of GDP from Bank of Ghana, right, which is deficit financing, because they did not give COVID as a reason. They said the markets were difficult for the government. You can read the NPS. So, frankly, by 2019, much of what happened in 2020 in the name of COVID, which some of us pointed out, was a serious correction. And that correction did not come with expenditure management. And that is why we could not, bring the deterioration, to an end. All that we did was, because we were putting bailout costs and others below the line and not adding them to the deficit and to the debt, once they were corrected, we had to do the correct thing. And we used much of those resources. But it didn't come with expenditure cuts that would have sustained. And so, as Professor Adair said, the expenditure boom continued, including the presidential initiatives and whatever, and the free SSS, which for me, I'm on record to have said that in its unfettered form, please, unfettered form, there's no way we Ghana can sustain, that program. And I think we are being borne out by the fact that the students are not being fed. Parents have to come to the rescue. Some principals and others are saying they are going to, ask the students to pay fees anyway. Of course, that, has gone down. Let me also point out to one point, then I'll pause, please. When you do a program, it is not just the IMF which is at the table. The African Development Bank is at the table. The World Bank is at the table. The development partners are at the table. Anybody, in fact, the rating agencies are observing. Those who give you loan are also observing. And that is the essence. Now, we know the fund. We know the fund for its austerity in developing countries. We do not know the fund for other inputs and advice that they give, including the path of correction. Would you believe that all the laws, from tax laws to PFM, Public Financial Management Act, and in some respects, even the PFMA and the rest, all those nearly 15 or so laws that we did, majority of them were drafted by the legal department of the IMF, given their global experience.
I see.
Would you believe that when it came to guarantees and we were going to the market, it was the Treasury Division of the World Bank that came to the assistance of the country in this, the partial risk guarantee, which went to support, which the World Bank itself did, and the one that supported the bond. So there is more expertise. In fact, when it comes to all other, including GIZ, development partners and the rest, look to the IMF for their policy guidance when it comes to improving tax administration, including improving public expenditure management, improving debt management, in addition to the advice that they give to the central bank. And so the fund has its regional departments, including the African department, that helps with correction. But there are the fiscal affairs departments, there is a statistics department, where there's one Ghanaian who was very prominent there, Dr. Kuma, who now chairs, Sanchat, and others. Those departments are there to provide both structural, macroeconomic and other.
I get your point.
To countries. And I think it's important that we bear this in mind. And those are the minds that are also going to come to bring their advantage. And in fact, if you look at some of the voices from private sector, both retired and current, who are saying either openly or quietly that we should go for an IMF program, I think it's about time we listen. Dr. Johnson and others, because we are in a situation where we are crowding out seriously the private sector with a dependence on the domestic because we do not have access. And we are even with that, we are having auction failures, which suggest strongly, that, the domestic market is not big enough. These are the issues that are discussed are being discussed.
I have a question. That you are talking about. Sorry. Yes, I have a question, and that question, I would need you to answer it in a minute.
Yes.
The measures that were introduced in March to stem the economic problems we had, have the measures failed or yielded the needed results? I'm talking about the cuts that were made to expenditure lines and all the other things, including e-levy that was introduced. In a minute, can you say whether they have failed or they have yielded the needed results?
Let's make a distinction. Remember, the budget is heavily dependent on debt. And once we couldn't go to the markets, it means that we didn't get our money. So let's make a distinction between projected expenditure cuts and accumulation of arrears as a result of not being able, to get the money, to finance them. There's a difference. And so let us wait. I'll come back after the media review to see whether there were real cuts, not just cuts, in the name of expenditures that could not be paid for simply because there was no money to pay for them.
Okay, I get your point. Now, Professor Adair, is this point that I ask you to boldly state whether we have lost options, whether the current measures that were introduced actually did yield the needed results, or we need to shift gear and head the direction of the IMF?
First of all, let us say that it's true, according to Arise Ghana and the
demonstrators, yeah.
Yes, but we as a people must be very careful, because if we are not, we may throw the baby with the bath water. The April, May, June, historically, are the worst economic months, plus a little bit of July, whereby July in Tree is called Kitaunsa, hold your hand or else you may steal, because of the economic, the food crisis that come perennially. Therefore, in our evaluating the policies, we must note that we are evaluating them at the worst of the period, even if there was nothing at all, because every May, June, July, food prices shoot up. That showed our systematic failure. So that's number one. So number two, we must, I think that there were some economic policy challenges and then exaggerated programs which are contributed to where we are. But also, we have come to a point where we are partly because of the COVID and that of the Ukrainian war. So this coming to this, I think that we must not say that, we are judging the policies during what these 3 months have done. That said, I think that the policies, their impact have been inadequate, in the sense that what are the, how much has been the reduction in expenditure? Of course, the ministers and the president did cut their salaries by 30%, which of course was a good leadership gesture. But what is realized is peanuts in terms of the national situation. They spend a lot of expenditures are being undertaken. I don't have the figures to be able to say so, but when the ministries of the big spenders, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Health, which takes about 16% of our GDP, Ministry of Education, almost think that now they can bring, and the policies are okay, what they want to do, but at this moment, we are going to expand, the STEMs, the TVET, and that. So I don't see sufficient deep cut. And the revenue mobilization has not been easy. Again, of course, we know e-levy has not yielded as much as some of us actually thought it would yield, that over time, things will improve. So the revenue mobilization, we are waiting for the midterm, I don't think has been as good as possible. And therefore, when you take all these things together, I'm sure, I don't know the figures, but the arrears unpaid, as Tego said, might be high. So yes, I'm quite sympathetic that this is not the right time to be able to assess fully whether it has been successful. But this indication of inability to bring expenditure down, and if government were to yield to the 20% increase in wages COLA they are requesting, which is impossible now for it to be done anyway, then we will be in big mess as a country, and we will pay dearly for it. So on the whole, the measures have had very limited impact. That's what I will say.
IMF, should we go or we should not go? Mindful of the current situation.
I think that the IMF now is a very strong option unless the government can come up with, quote unquote, to quote the previous government, a very stronger homegrown measures to mitigate the situation. We would then have no choice. In fact, we'll be forced into it. But I hope that by the end of the week or next week, well, they will come out of it. At this moment, I'm not part of the discussions like I was as part of Senche. So, but I think that the prognosis are such that if we don't see national cohesion in policies with the institutions all singing and the president providing unusual leadership with the Ministry of Finance being able to tell the subsidiary ministries what they should do and what they cannot do, there will be no option than going to the IMF.
Prof, I am grateful for your time this evening, and I guess we can actually wrap it up here. Mr. Tekpe, I am also grateful for your time this evening. Gentlemen, you'll be wonderful with your thoughts on this particular show. And we sure should be still, and we understand that there'll be something coming up soon, maybe tomorrow. We'll be getting to know the outcome of that all-important review of government's main economic measures aimed at stemming the tide when it comes to economic decline in the country. But for now, many thanks to you for joining us on UPfront today. My name is Raymond Acquah.